Welcome back to Fast Market here on the Schwab Network. It's time for cash tags. For that, let's bring in our next guest. That's going to be Andy Swan, co-founder of LikeFolio. Welcome back to the show, Andy.
Thank you.
All right, so we're talking booze today. I think maybe Constellation Brands investors need a drink right now because this stock has been just a horrible performer over the last year and a half or so, hitting 5-year lows earlier or late in June. I mean, you guys seeing data that's turning for this company? It's having a nice bump today, but as KG and I mentioned, a lot of these names that have been beaten up are getting bids today. But going into earnings, are you guys seeing any data that's positive for this company? Because I think year-over-year revenue growth is supposed to be down over 4% on this report.
Yeah, when we look at the LikeFolio data, and when a stock's down this much, we do like to look for something positive, some light at the end of the tunnel that might give investors some reprieve or some optimism in an earnings call, or give the executives something positive to talk about. It's just really, really difficult to find with this company. They're at a structural disadvantage. Alcohol demand is really kind of falling off of a cliff, especially in the younger generations. Gen Z is drinking 20% less than older generations, with a lot of, vast majority of Gen Z even, having the expectation that they're going to cut down even more. So there's a big generational shift that's hitting at the core of this business, and you can see it in the LikeFolio data. Web visits are in an absolute free fall. Site traffic has dropped nearly 60% since early 2023, which just signals to us some serious demand deterioration. It doesn't mean that, sales are down 60%. They're clearly not. It just means interest in the brand, people checking out what they're offering, sort of that the new potential customer falling off of a cliff. You mentioned the stock is down big, and that's part of the reason why. The other, kind of red flag we see going into this earnings report is that, beer demand, Modelo, Corona, Pacifico, we're seeing all of those show flat or negative search trends going into Independence Day weekend. It's kind of one of those things where it's, if you can't grow demand during what is beer's, biggest week of the year, the outlook is pretty grim. So for Constellation, the bar is low. I think that all of our data shows that the bar should be very low. The company likely finds a way to get under this bar. There's just not a whole lot to be excited about when it comes to Constellation Brands.
Andy, is this more of a fundamental situation within the company or executive leadership, or do you think that they might be also losing some market share to other competitors that have had some headwinds in the past, Budweiser, Bud Light, things of that nature, but maybe they have turned the brand around and maybe getting some of that market share back from some of those issues that they've seen in the past? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that they're facing macro headwinds, like I said, with the younger generations cutting back on drinking. I also think that they're kind of a victim of their own success. Modelo, Corona, they had kind of a once in a lifetime type of run in terms of gaining market share. And now, there's a lot of reason to believe that the consumer is just getting a lot more diversified in what they do. There's seltzers, there's other beer brands. I just think that we saw demand growth for the brands that Constellation owns, and then now we're seeing demand growth for brands and products that other companies own. Combine that with the macro headwinds, on alcohol consumption in general, and you've got a really, really negative time to be in the, in Constellation Brands. And we see that continuing. At some point, this becomes a value play. But before we're going to call that bottom or even attempt to think about it, we've got to see some resurgence in the brands that they own. And, it's never a good thing when an alcohol and cocktail company's primary, saving grace or, hope going into an earnings call is that they talk about mocktails and wellness drinks, so they're trying to batten down the hatches during a bad storm. I understand that, but we're going to have to see some real turnaround in the data before we can even come close to getting positive on this stock.
Andy, when you look at it, you mentioned the changing trends with the younger generation. You know, throw my son in there and all of his buddies. But at some point, when you look at this, if the tariffs get kind of through and passed over the next couple of weeks here, that's going to probably lighten the load a little bit, maybe on some of their liquor brands and stuff like that. But you're heading into summer, Andy, and are there seasonality issues that you guys see, or tailwinds going into the summer where people are drinking more of their beer because their beer brands have definitely been carrying the company over the last several years?
Yeah, the beer brands carry the company, and unfortunately, this is the time. This is kind of the key time. You know how retailers, have Black Friday through Christmas to kind of make their mark in terms of, are we winning over new customers or not? This is the time of year, it's summertime, when a company like Constellation Brands should be winning over new customers. And the LikeFolio data that we have just tells us that they're not. And that the customers that they've won over the past few years are pretty loyal, and that's a good base. But the Wall Street's expectations of those brands continuing to grow and that demand continuing to grow have just set the stock up for failure, because it was just kind of got to the point of law of large numbers. And so we think, this is the time of year that should be happening, and it's not. And so it's going to be difficult for the company to provide Wall Street with any sort of positive message for the remainder of the year that isn't just purely, structural, internal. They may come out with some cost-cutting measures that gets Wall Street somewhat excited about profit margins, something like that. But from a consumer demand perspective, this name right now is dead in the water.
Yeah, looking for those catalysts. What's the earnings score on this one going into it, Andy? You guys don't seem very positive at all.
Yeah, if the stock was flat, we'd have a super negative earnings score. But since the stock is down, 35% year over year, we're pretty neutral. I think there's at least an outside chance they could come up with some reason to bid it up. But my bet is that we stay about where we are. We move a little lower through the rest of the week.
Yep, not lack of catalysts. All right, great stuff. As always, Andy, appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, that's Andy Swan, co-founder of LikeFolio, breaking down the Constellation brands. And you know what, KG, you look over their last few earnings and, they've kind of been reflected. We usually talk STZ with LikeFolio at least every quarter, if not a couple times a year, and it has been souring a little bit as far as their sentiment data. So I looked at a strategy, KG, that kind of sets up with what